In my previous episode, I went over how to write and design better villains, so let's see how well I can follow my own guidelines. If you haven't watched part 1 of my talk on villains, you really should, but I'll recap some important points here. In order to create villains, or any character really, that is at least decent, we need to ask ourselves a few questions about them. These questions are designed to keep them focused and consistent within the story we are trying to tell. Number 1, motivation. A clearly defined and thought out reason for why these people are doing what they are doing. Number 2, have their actions support their views and goals. This should show the player how the villains are dangerous and why they need to be stopped. Number 3, give them a soul. Have them show personality and a story arc. Everybody comes from somewhere, they all have a history that got them to where they are. You don't have to show that history, but there should be lots of evidence of it. I also like to ask, what could the player learn from them? I use this as an extra filter to make sure that in this game for children, there is a moral to the story. Although really it is a game for all ages, it would be nice if people could feel like they got something out of it. Also in the last episode, I went through a list of things that we, as game designers, could explore to help make our villains feel like an actual threat, ways they could antagonize the player. Next episode, I'll add some more ways that they could antagonize the player, but for this practice, you'll mostly see me taking advantage of the points brought up last episode. Well, this is probably enough talking without an example at this point, so let's give it a go. Let's write a villainous organization. As an extra bit of challenge, I'm forbidding myself from these villains having anything to do with a legendary Pokemon. If you are wondering why, then you haven't watched my episode on legendary Pokemon, and you should. Now, we could write any Pokemon story involving villains without calling them a team, but since it is an established trend, I'll just run with it in this exercise. Besides, the name is not the important part anyway. With all that done, allow me to spin you the tale of Team Eco. You are told of a nefarious group that is trying to sabotage local farms by poisoning their lands. To borrow an idea from my previous episode, let's say they are working on something called Project Misery. In a new region based on somewhere that uses a large amount of land for agriculture and having many farms all lined up next to each other, perhaps Denmark or the Netherlands, a Pokemon exclusive to the region called Grubble is known as the Wasteful Pokemon. It voraciously gobbles up any kind of food and pukes a toxic sludge that, although creates very fertile soil for berry trees, causing them to produce a lot of extra berries, it is useless to all other plants, at least for a few years, which is great for the Grubble as they like to eat berries the most, but not so great for the local farms. Not to mention that the sludge can poison people and Pokemon for a few days afterwards while it airs off. Team Eco owns the largest berry tree farm in the world, using the different berries to create all the kinds of potions you are familiar with, and then sells them to the other regions. Eco seems to be capturing a lot of Grubble and other Pokemon. When encountering the grunts, they steal your money, potions, including antidotes, as well as berries that accomplish the same things. All they tell you is that it is for the greater good. Townsfolk might remark, they make all these potions, but now they are hoarding them to drive up all the prices. Throughout the game, there are a few incidents where a swarm of Grubble would occur around local farms, eating their crops and poisoning their fields, with Team Eco being right at the heart of it. Mechanically, this could mean that in that area during the swarms, the player's Pokemon could become poisoned just by walking around, sapping the whole team's health. Perhaps Pokemon found in the wild, with the exception of Grubble, could start at lower health and are already poisoned. Thankfully, the Pokemon centers are more than equipped to cure your Pokemon and those of the farmers immediately, but townsfolk express their concern for all the wild Pokemon that won't get treatment and die. If you like to take some time to talk to NPCs, you'll learn of how the people used to be very happy with Team Eco. After all, they were formed by a collection of local farms only 30-odd years ago. With their founding and focus on berry trees, the rest of the local farms have been expanding and specializing in new crops, relieving competition and bringing about a golden age of commerce to the region. But recently, things have gone incredibly sour. Team Eco has been buying up all the lands made worthless by these Grobble at a price that doesn't entirely compensate for the loss. People would also quickly point out that since Team Eco has been hoarding all the antidotes and potions, the citizens would have a harder time keeping their Pokemon safe from attacks. Additionally, during any Grobble swarm, Team Eco overruns and controls the local Pokemon Center, forcing people to wait in line behind grunts. The only thing you can get out of those grunts in those centers is that their work is more important than your Pokemon's needs. One NPC would explain that he swore he could have seen a grunt just pouring antidote on the ground, not even using it for sick Pokemon. What a disgrace. And then, on top of all of this, to add insult to injury, they seem to be working on a radio frequency broadcast that can make Pokemon miserable. You are occasionally given a task to investigate an area where all the Pokemon are really upset, and it is Team Eco who are responsible by using a localized broadcast. It is here that you learn of Project Misery. The professors and maybe your rival propose that because sad Pokemon don't fight as hard, they would be easier to defeat and catch. Also, as the classic grunts that they are, they can occasionally be heard talking about an event called The Takeover, and that Pokemon need to be controlled. As a bit of a side note and extra flavor, there are some details that the player can notice on their own over time. High-ranking members of Team Eco tend to have Chanseys and Blissies on their teams, making them rather formidable. For those who like to fill out the decks, Grobble's entry says that upon hatching in the wild, they bury themselves deep underground to sleep for a decade before resurfacing. Curiously, however, although the species is entirely male, similar to the Nidoran species, you can discover through breeding that the females are a different flying Pokemon you can never find in the wild. Gleeble, the Happy Aura Pokemon. The Pokédex points out that upon hatching, they migrate to the distant mountains. For those who like to breed Pokemon, when specifically pairing the two together, they produce 2 eggs with a 60-40 split to male and female. As time progresses, talking to people who are setting up festive decorations reveals that the rarely seen Gleeble all flock to the region in a mass migration once a decade, and their happiness vibes inspire the towns to make a big celebration of the event. In fact, the last few decades have been getting more spectacular than the previous ones. During that time, the player will encounter them everywhere, but of course, Team Eco has other ideas for that special day. Doing a Team Rocket, they take over a radio tower to broadcast their misery signal. A surprising result of this is that the chance of a wild Pokemon fleeing from battles goes way up because they don't want to fight. This should motivate the player to resolve the story instead of ignoring it. Time to storm the castle. You and your rival work together to bring down this organization once and for all. In the process, you can find notes about how they were actually looking for a way to cure the soil before the takeover event. Your rival says that they must have wanted to have a cure for the soil so they can farm whatever they want once they have bought up all the land. You break into their hideout. They have almost completed their plan as the takeover is apparently at hand, and there is the leader, Demeter. Your rival stays behind to deal with the grunts making an organized regroup while you march into battle. Upon defeating Demeter, they say, "You have no idea what you are doing," and tells you everything. If you haven't already put it all together before this big twist reveal, you are more than welcome to pause the video now to Sherlock it all together. Otherwise, continuing on. It turns out that Team Eco has been trying to save all the local farms in the region. Without Project Misery in action, the Gleeble's combined happiness auras will cause them all to be so happy that the Gleeble and Grobble will want to breed. In the past, the farmers kept the Grobble at bay by defeating them as they popped up in the fields they didn't want them in, but didn't notice anything wrong with the berry tree fields they had. Sure, berries went missing, but then they would explode in number, so nobody complained. When the biggest farms combined to create Team Eco, all the smaller ones converted their berry tree fields into other produce. For the last few decades, all the farms expanded and have been producing more and more food than the region has ever had. The last patch of Grobble wasn't as noticeable because they spread out further. Generation after generation, their population has been growing exponentially. If this generation goes unhindered, the Grobble explosion next time will destroy not just all the farms, but the poison could be enough to kill everyone, including all the Pokemon of the wild. The berry trees might be okay, but the rest of the ecosystem won't be. They need to enact Project Misery to stop them from breeding, or else the Grobble are going to take over all the farms. Team Eco has been invading the farms during the Grobble swarms to try to catch them all and minimize the damage. Although they greatly slowed down the sales of their potions to other regions, they couldn't stop shipping them off because so many trainers in the world rely on them. Hence, they needed to stock up on everything in this region for their trainers and all the wild Pokemon they encountered. Pouring a bunch of it on the ground is so far the best countermeasure they have for the poisoned soil. Lastly, they were buying the damaged lands so as to try to compensate farmers enough to help them last a few years without work. Once the soil becomes fertile for all plants again, they would give the lands back for free, taking care of them in the meantime. They haven't been able to pay generous amounts for the bought-up lands in case all the farms across the region need to be bought, which would be too expensive to give a fair price for all of them. They haven't told anyone about the coming disaster because they didn't want to incite panic. Demeter believed the farmers would simply buy and hoard all the potions and antidotes for their own Pokemon instead of getting them where they are needed most. So now the player has a choice. Should they shut down the signal and try to combat the impending crisis themselves, or should they turn around and fight their rival one more time to prevent them from shutting it off? To them, you just decided to join the villains in that case. What could possibly be possessing you? You do have the secret option of going around the region employing the help from all the friends you've made along the way, if indeed you have been doing the optional nice things to make those friends. What would you do? Alright, now let's look at this story and see if it, at the very least, hits all our criteria. Number 1, do they have a motive? Yes, they do. They are trying to save as many people and Pokemon as they can from an impending disaster. Number 2, do their actions support their goal? Again, yes. They are gathering every resource and mobilizing to areas of interest for them. On the plus side, they are also showing themselves to be formidable and threatening. They take potions and antidotes from the player and cause delays in being able to access a Pokemon Center. In the earlier parts of the story, it seemed they were also causing the swarms that would be trouble for the player and local farms often enough. Number 3, do they have a soul and a story arc? I would hope so. It comes down to how the script for the Grunts and Demeter plays out. They could be written to be exhausted to the point of being short with the player in conversation. Demeter might be encountered a few times, and each time becoming more and more distressed at how the player keeps hindering their plans. Perhaps we could see them be rude and refuse help from their Grunts, who are actually well-meaning and understand what is at stake. Your decision in the end, and how well you perform that mission, would affect Demeter's character development drastically. Finally, what could the player learn from them? I would hope that they see that it is better to share knowledge and get help from those around them. If Team Eco had the ability to oppress the locals, then they had the ability to educate and empower them. You can alleviate panic by not just telling the populace of an impending disaster, but also informing them of the plan to avoid it. On a self-critical note, unfortunately, the player could decide that the moral of the story is that people in power know better and we should let them do what they want, which is obviously awful. To counter that, we could make them even worse villains by having them let certain Pokemon die because it is easier on their resources to isolate known poisoned areas and let it run its course, with, naturally, the player interfering and saving the day. This turns them from antagonists to criminal antagonists, and so, in comparison, that people in power moral becomes even less appealing. Well, I guess it is time for this very vulnerable moment where I ask what you thought of my villains. Let me know in the comments if you thought this would fit and work well in the world of Pokemon. Even if you're not a fan of Team Eco, they should still demonstrate how we can create strong, memorable Pokemon villains. After all, this can't be a study and practice of game design without feedback. Please like the video and hit the blossom to help my channel. If you enjoyed this, or are curious about the rest of my series, subscribe and check out the playlist. Thank you for watching, continue to be wonderful, and I'll see you next time.